Outside Acre, August 20th, 1191. An aide calls Saladin out of his tent. The Crusaders, it seems, are making some kind of move. In the months since Acre's surrender, Saladin and Richard have been mired in negotiations. Saladin has agreed to pay 200,000 dinars, return the True Cross, and release captives, in exchange for Richard releasing the 2,600 men of Acre's garrison. But these talks have drawn out as Saladin scrapes up the money and seeks assurances that Richard will release prisoners of rank. And when the deadline for the full payment arrived, Saladin could only offer 100,000 dinars for half of the prisoners. Richard said no, and now his troops are on the move. Clearly, this troop deployment is some new negotiating tactic. Then, Saladin sees the tied-up prisoners at the center of the Crusader army. That doesn't make any... No. Swords flash and spears strike, and in an industrial display of brutality, Saladin's army watches as Richard's men butcher every last Muslim captive. The fight for Jerusalem has begun. After the siege of Acre, Saladin's position was more precarious than ever. He had poured enormous amounts of both blood and treasure into its defense. And now, in addition to the humiliation of the loss, he had to shoulder the shame of being unable to save his captured men, his only recourse being to execute Crusader captives in retaliation. His army was exhausted and dispirited, crucial support from the sultans and caliphs were drying up, and his Egyptian fleet, berthed in the harbor, had been captured. Worse than all of that, during the siege of Acre, his Ayyubid power structure, the family members he'd placed in high positions, failed to deliver. Key relations had held back reinforcements and resources, looking after their own domains rather than aiding their sultan. The truth was, Acre revealed the limitations and weaknesses of Saladin's leadership. True, he was a charismatic commander who was excellent at inspiring troops and rallying disparate camps behind a single message, and no one could doubt that his magnanimous generosity, spotting talented soldiers and administrators, then rewarding them handsomely to gain support, was politically astute. But more than anything, he was lucky. Nur ad-Din had died just as he and Saladin were about to come to blows. Guy had neglected to leave a garrison at Jerusalem when he marched to Hattin, and Frederick Barbarossa drowned in a river. This luck tended to look a lot like divine favor, supporting Saladin's claim to be God's instrument. But it was becoming increasingly clear that Saladin, despite his many talents, was not a great general. And with this series of losses, the flip side of his best qualities were coming out. His extreme generosity now looked foolish, having left the army financially vulnerable. His charisma and campaign of rallying support by sponsoring schools and preachers to carry his message now just looked a lot like dragging allies into a costly conflict. And with his luck seemingly deserting him, people began questioning whether God still favored him. So what did Saladin do? He turned to his best weapon, letters. He and his scribes drafted correspondence to all of his allies, emphasizing that if they did not send aid, Jerusalem might be lost. Despite Saladin's loss of face, the crisis of losing Acre, and potentially Jerusalem, re-galvanized his patrons in Baghdad and allies whose support had wavered. Which was good for him, because Richard was now in sole command of the Crusade, and he was ready to move. After the Crusaders' victory at Acre, several nobles declared their part of the Third Crusade done and went home. This included Philip II of France, who, having seen the Count of Flanders die during the siege, decided to return in order to settle the succession. Richard was now the only king in the army, and able to minimize some of the political infighting. For instance, who would be king of Jerusalem? Conrad, who held Tyre, or Guy? Well, Guy was Richard's relative, so that kind of solved that. But more important was Richard's monopolization of military strategy. And unlike Saladin, there was no question of Richard's abilities as a general. Richard marched south, but not an ill-considered march like the one that had doomed the Christian army at Hattin. Rather, a steady, disciplined move along the coast, supported and supplied by a fleet of ships. As before, Saladin harried his force with archers, trying to slow them as he had at Hattin. But the difference was, Richard had planned for a slow, careful march, never stretching his force out to make it vulnerable. So slowly they marched, with the heavily armored knights from Europe sometimes having 10 arrows sticking from their backs. And this march worried Saladin, because it was clear that Richard intended to take the city of Jaffa, one of the ports serving Jerusalem. And not only would this cut off Saladin's Palestinian territories from the sea, it meant Richard could then strike one of two targets, both vital to the Sultan. The first and most obvious was Jerusalem, the Holy City. But the second, the city of Ascalon, was the gateway between the Ayyubid territories of Syria and Egypt. A terrifying prospect, since Egyptian wealth funded most of Saladin's armies. He had to strike. Arsuf Wood, September 7th, 1191. Saladin's forces come out of the forest, banging kettle drums, blowing trumpets, and banging gongs. Almost entirely mounted, their light crossbowmen fire, then part for the cavalry to come through and unleash their own rain of arrows. Then, when gaps open in the Crusader line, they surge forward with swords and maces, until they're beaten back. The Crusader vanguard has already reached Jaffa, and Saladin hopes to stretch the army out by goading units into a counterattack, then surrounding and destroying them. He goes to the battle line personally, urging his troops on. But the Knights Hospitaller have had enough. Against orders, they unexpectedly charge Saladin's troops, catching many of his archers dismounted. And after a hesitation, the rest of the Crusader army follows in the attack. King Richard himself is seen, fighting in the thick of combat. It's a rout. Saladin's army flees, deeply dishonored, and the Christians take Jaffa, and thus the sea. Saladin's response is scorched earth. Knowing he has to choose between the Holy City and Ascalon, he makes the only real choice. He destroys Ascalon's defenses, as well as those of every fortress and captured Crusader castle between Jaffa and Jerusalem. Then he mounts an intelligence campaign, sending spies into the Crusader camp and tasking Bedouin tribesmen with kidnapping and interrogating Crusader prisoners. And he also opened secret negotiations, because Richard once again wanted to talk, though this time it was a little different. So Saladin sent his most dependable brother, Al-Adil, to handle the diplomacy and the spying which went along with it. Al-Adil had been Saladin's partner in conquest for a long while, managing the wealth of Egypt so it could be funneled to military pursuits. But he was also a charming figure, an excellent sportsman and hunter, and an embodiment of the developing European idea of chivalry. Richard took a liking to him immediately, and with these negotiations, the Crusaders' image of Saladin as the son of Satan began to dissipate, replaced by the image of a fair and noble opponent. Moral of the story, get to know your neighbors before you decide to go to war with them. In fact, Richard took such a liking to Al-Adil that he proposed a secret plan to marry Al-Adil to his sister. Oh, you heard that right. Richard wanted to make Al-Adil his brother-in-law and install the couple as king and queen of Jerusalem. Muslim troops would hold the city, and Christian troops the towns outside. Saladin seriously considered this, even though he knew it might have been a ploy to try to separate the brothers by appealing to greed. But then Richard insisted that Al-Adil would have to convert to Christianity, so it was a hard pass. With negotiations now breaking down, Richard opted to march to Ascalon and on to Jerusalem, because Saladin's army was falling apart. The crises had mounted for Saladin. His leaders were restless, and his empire in need of maintenance. His method of stalling the crusade by keeping an army in the field, threatening their forces for years on end, had taken a major toll on all of his men. So, on December 12th, his commanders forced him to disband the army, and Saladin had to take what remained of his personal troops and fortify Jerusalem against the imminent attack. The defenders were so dispirited, there was question whether any would stand. Richard, seeing victory within his reach, marched for Jerusalem. The peasants in his army, though beaten down by the unusually harsh winter weather and eaten by lice and camp disease, were still kind of in a religious ecstasy. Some had traveled and fought for years to achieve this goal. And now, they were finally here, and they would take the holy city from the hated Saladin. But after they took it, Richard couldn't help but wonder, what then? There would be a counterattack, and they might not be able to hold the city. Not to mention his supply lines were stretched too long for a siege if it came to that. Particularly in winter. Despite Saladin's defeats, he had slowed Richard just enough that attacking Jerusalem now was too dangerous. So 12 miles from Jerusalem, he ordered his army to go back to Ascalon for the winter. Now this was the right decision militarily, but it most assuredly broke the Crusaders' morale, especially when it leaked that Richard had been secretly negotiating with Saladin, so dissent grew in the Crusader ranks. In 4 months, Saladin had lost most of the cities he'd won after Hattin, but he still held Jerusalem. And that's when it hit him. He didn't need to beat Richard. All he had to do was outlast him. A most legendary thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Gunnar Clovis, Alicia Bramble, Kyle Murgatroyd, Casey Muscha, O'Reels1, and Dominic Valenciana for helping make this show possible.